here?
I am going to put on my laptop.
Cool. Okay, so you guys are being more lazy too.
I guess so.
Great.
Hey, how's it going?
So it looks like somebody's left that behind. So whoever's speaking should
Hold this
hook it to your lapel and then just. Yep. Okay. I'll keep an eye on each other, try to make sure that you're passing it, right? So that the sound works.
I would ask if you have multiple presenters and you're all standing around here, you can keep it here and it will pick people up.
Nice.
The other guy who came here said, no, you need to put it on your lapel. So
It's better for sound to do it that way.
Okay.
Maybe I'll do it and we can pass it.
How easy.
Okay.
So I guess you guys can decide. And then this is associated with the room, or did somebody just leave this behind?
That should be associated with the room.
Cool. So do you have a...
Is there like a USB?
Is yours a PC?
Yes, it is.
Sometimes does it speak HDMI?
Yes, it does.
So we just have to see if there's a USB-C connected as well. Here's, this is USB-C.
I can also do USB-C. Yeah. Well, I can plug in HDMI here.
And is this the right? Does your laptop take USB?
It does.
Okay, there you go.
So let's plug it in and see. Thank you. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for your help.
The test cases auto-grading thing at the end. And I haven't realized the entire piece that has to be auto-gradable, so you can't have, for example, like a problem where they might need to go actually look at your modeling file, like where a TA would need to look at it and say, like, oh, you've modeled this problem wrong.
Yeah.
So I am still doing some modeling parts, but you have to, like, the way that we can grade it is you can say, you're going to run it, and then I'll check what the final plan is.
I see.
But for that, then you have to make sure that their plan will look like your plan. So basically, you just give them I'm writing like stub files for things where it says, okay, this is the name of every action. These are like
right. You have to like really constrain everything that they can do. No, that makes sense.
What the like parameters could be to those, because that way you'll come out at the end and we'll say like sense L1, L2 for everybody.
Yes.
But then because of that, like it takes away a bit of, I guess, everything
like the creativity.
Like, here's half of a model, go at like some conditions. So what I'm adding instead, because I wasn't sure then if that's like enough. If that's like interesting enough, is having them do part of the conversion from the PDKPDLL to the PDDL path.
Cool.
So I'm just giving them like I'm not actually using Christian's library for this because it's a little bit too complicated.
Okay.
Like I found it, like there's a lot of stuff there, and I didn't want them to have to like look into his code too much because it's such a large code base. So I'm giving them like a simplified version where I have like some predicate and proposition classes. Yeah, I just meant like I don't want them to like think they like if they were like, oh, what's this predicate class like? And they have to go like read through this code. Even I found it like difficult to follow like the flow sometimes of like where do I find the class that's doing this?
Yeah.
So like for actually doing the planning, I'm using like his library still and like the wrappers I have around that. But for their part, like I just defined some of our own little cool successes.
as our group. This is our turnout. Yeah, I take it a little personally.
And it is raining, so past participation is, and your feedback is absolutely key. And so for those of you who are here, I really appreciate that you are here. Right? So for those who are not here, are going to need to watch the videotape and provide feedback. Right?
Nice.
Okay. So the forms are there again, right? You kind of know the drill. Right? We have 2 more advanced lectures kind of at this point, and this week we're finishing it up by talking about epistemic planning. So we're taking the logic, which was beautiful and confusing, right? But we have to think what it's useful for. And today's lecture is going to be explaining to us how to do that. While Yuning and I had a heated debate over the last hour and a half about how to flow epistemic logic and planning into the PPM planning that we did earlier in the course. Right? So we really appreciate it. Okay, so we look forward to that, and then we have one more advanced lecture on Monday.
Awesome. Thank you, and thank you everyone who came to our lecture. I'm Alex Forsey, and today my teammates Lucian and Robert and I are going to be talking about the application of epistemic logic in planning. So Yuning gave a lecture about epistemic logic right before spring break, and we talked about the types of things that epistemic logic can represent. It's a formal representation of our agent knowledge and beliefs. So we can say things like, Bob knows a secret, Alice also knows a secret, Bob doesn't know that Alice knows a secret, and Alice knows that Bob doesn't know that she knows this secret. When we apply epistemic logic to planning, this allows us to reason from the perspective of other agents that we're working with and plan our own actions accordingly. So, for example, if we're talking in terms of HRI, this might allow our agent to model the beliefs of the humans that it's working with. So say something like, I think you hold this belief, and plan its own action. So I know that belief to be false, so I should help you out. We'll take a look at, so this is a demo from the ICAPS 2020 tutorial on epistemic planning, and this robot is equipped with epistemic logic formation, so it's able to model not only the state of the world, but also the human's beliefs. So right now, the robot knows that the red block is in box 1, and it also knows that the human knows that the red block is in box 1. They also modeled this with just very basic intent recognition, so that when the human reaches for a box, the robot understands that the human is intending to interact with the object the human believes is in the box. So, for example, if the human reaches forward for box 1, the robot understands the human is intending to interact with the red block because the robot knows the human knows the red block is in box 1. In this case, that's the true state of the world, so the robot's not going to intervene or say anything. But if we visit a state where the human might leave and another agent comes in and changes the state of the world while the human is gone, so moves the red block from box 1 into box 2, our robot is able to model this, understands that the red block is now in box 2, and is also able to understand that our human now has a false belief about where the red block is. So if we see our human reach forward to interact with box 1, our robot's going to come forward and push box 2. So the robot recognizes the human's intending to interact with the red block, understands that the human has a false belief of where the red block is, and acts. So it also gives a verbal announcement. It says if you're looking for the red block, it's in box 2. So this is just an example of an application of epistemic planning to HRI. We can see that it's applicable to both collaborative scenarios, and we can also imagine it being applicable to non-collaborative scenarios, so adversarial scenarios. A scenario that we're going to be continuously revisiting in this lecture is the coin-in-the-box scenario. So in this, we have 3 agents, a green agent, a blue agent, and our robot. The initial condition is that we have a coin in a box, and no agent knows if the coin is heads or tails. The actions that are available to the agents is they can peek in the box, allowing them to know if the coin is heads or tails. They can make an announcement about whether the coin is heads or tails. They can make a false or true announcement. And they can also distract or signal each other. So another description of an agent will be whether it's looking or not looking at the box. If it's looking at the box, it sees another agent peek into the box. If it's not looking at the box, it doesn't see that. And distract and signal are ways of either making an agent not look at the box by distracting them or signaling them to look at the box. And we can imagine some potential goals that we might want to solve in this scenario are that maybe we want to achieve a deceptive goal. So we want the robot to know that the coin is heads, but we want the other agents to believe that it's tails. So we want the robot to peek in the box, see the true value of the coin, and make a dishonest announcement about the value of the coin. We might also want to model a scenario where the robot and the green agent are on a team. So, for example, we want the robot to know the coin is heads, and for the green agent to see that the robot peeks in the box. So the green agent knows that the robot knows heads or tails, but we want the blue agent to be in the dark. So we want the blue agent to be distracted and not looking at the box when the robot looks. And we're going to talk about ways that we might achieve these types of goals. So the general setup of our epistemic planning problem is that we have a set of agents, a set of atomic propositions that describe the world. We have our initial state that describes the initial epistemic state and the initial world state. So in this case, our initial epistemic state is that the agents don't know anything, and our initial world state might be something like the blue agent and the robot are looking at the box. The green agent is not looking at the box. We have a goal epistemic state. So this is a formula formulated in epistemic logic involving our agents and our actions. If we're trying to model the second goal that we just talked about, we want the robot to know heads, green to know that the robot knows heads or knows tails, and we do not want blue to know that the robot knows heads or tails. And then we have a set of finite actions that the agents can take that update both of the atomic propositions and our epistemic state. And a solution to our epistemic planning problem is going to be a sequential set of actions that take us from our initial state to our goal epistemic state. So in this example, our solution would be that the robot would distract B, so it's looking away, signal G, so it's looking, and then peek in the box. Are there any questions about this general problem setup? It's pretty straightforward. Today, what we're going to talk about are two approaches to solving these types of problems, so to finding these solutions. And these two approaches represent the two major paradigms in epistemic planning. So the first is this syntactic approach. We're operating directly on our belief formula. It's called RPMEP. This draws on PDDL, which we've seen previously. And the second is a semantic approach. So we're using forward heuristic search, in this case, to find a solution to our planning problem. And we're going to talk about generally the advantages and challenges of each and the types of problems that can be solved. So each of these approaches can solve a different subset of these goals. To accomplish this, I'm first going to give a quick recap on epistemic logic, recover a bit of what Yuning covered. Then we're going to dive into our first approach. Then we're going to touch a little bit on dynamic epistemic logic, which we briefly covered at the end of the last lecture, and get into the semantic approach. So I'm going to just start with some syntax and then get into our crypt key models and crypt key model subclasses. So we know in propositional logic that a well-formulated formula is composed of our propositions from our set of atomic propositions, their negation, and their disjunction. What epistemic logic adds are these two operators, so a knowledge operator and a belief operator that can describe the knowledge and beliefs of this finite set of agents. Our knowledge operator is technically epistemic logic, and the belief operator is technically stochastic knowledge, although we often group these together when we're talking about epistemic logic. The main intuition behind the difference between knowledge and belief, so an agent cannot know an untrue fact, but an agent can believe an untrue fact. And that's the key difference between these two. Another way that I find helpful to think about it is that agents can have conflicting beliefs. So one agent can believe phi and one agent can believe not phi, but they couldn't have conflicting knowledge. So an agent can know phi and another agent know not phi. We're going to revisit the muddy child logic puzzle that we also talked about previously. So if you remember, this describes a scenario where we have 3 children playing outside. Some of them end up with mud on their foreheads. They can see the other 2 children, but they can't see themselves. Their father comes out and tells them, at least one of you has mud on your forehead. If you know you have mud on your forehead, step forward now. So with propositional logic, a proposition we can write down. In this instance, we're modeling a world where all 3 children have mud on their forehead, so we can write down a formula about the state of the world, that each of the agents, the purple, red, and blue agent, are muddy. In epistemic logic, we're also able to write down formula about the knowledge of our agents. So our blue agent can see our purple agent. Our blue agent knows our purple agent is muddy. Our blue agent does not know that it is muddy, and it does not know that it is not muddy. So it considers itself being muddy a possibility. And also our blue agent knows that our red agent knows if it's muddy or not. So we are able to model that our blue agent is aware that the red agent can see it and knows if it's muddy or not. Any questions here on general syntax, epistemic logic? Okay. So moving forward to semantics, our Kripke model provides a way of kind of graphically representing all possible worlds. And it's composed of a few elements. So first is this set of possible worlds, this set of all possible interpretations of our model. So in the instance where the father hasn't said anything yet, we're talking about this 2-agent case where we're only modeling the red and the blue agent. These worlds describe, so these are binary operators describing muddy or not muddy. We have 4 possible worlds. So they could both be muddy, one of them could be muddy, or neither of them could be muddy. We also have a propositional valuation. So the propositional valuation evaluated on a certain proposition returns the subset of all worlds where this proposition holds true. So, for example, evaluated on this proposition of muddy B, it's describing the subset of all worlds where B is muddy. So in this case, which worlds would this subset include? What are the worlds in this model where B is muddy? If these are just binary operators describing muddy or not muddy, the one on the left is red, the one on the right is blue. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So this is describing these 2 worlds in which the proposition muddy B holds true. And we also have these accessibility relations. So what this describes is that for a single agent, given a world, what are all possible worlds the agent believes it could be in at a certain time? So if we just think about this abstractly, from the perspective of the blue agent, if I can see the red agent and I know that it's muddy, then I might consider the worlds where the red agent is muddy and I'm muddy to be true, but I also might consider the world where the red agent is muddy and I'm not muddy to be possible. So it describes these worlds that an agent cannot distinguish between in the given world. And these bidirectional arrows are just representative of 2 directional arrows. So, for example, if we're looking at the worlds where neither of them are muddy, the blue agent might consider this world a possibility, and it also might consider the world a possibility where the red agent isn't muddy and it is muddy because it can't see itself. So what might this look like for the world where the red agent is not muddy, but the blue agent is muddy? So we're talking about this world, 0, 1. What are all the worlds that the red agent thinks it might be in? Right. So which 2 worlds? The left 2. Yeah, exactly. So it considers these 2 worlds to be a possibility. And we can use these relationships to say things like what Brandon just said, the red agent can't distinguish between 2 worlds where it is or isn't muddy. A pointed Kripke model is just a pairing of a Kripke model and the world that we currently assume to be actual. So in our case, if we're modeling an instance where both of the children are muddy, then this is just a pairing of our Kripke model with the world 1, 1, because this is the current physical state of the world. And we have different subclasses of Kripke models are defined by these different knowledge or belief properties that they satisfy. So there's a few common axioms that can be satisfied, that can describe subsets of knowledge and belief. And so I'll walk through them and I'll describe 2 important subclasses that we're going to use in our planning approaches. So these axioms, the first is the distribution axiom. This applies to all Kripke models, no matter the subclass. It just generally describes that an agent knows all logical consequences of its own knowledge. The truth axiom describes that an agent only knows facts. Consistency axiom is that an agent doesn't hold 2 conflicting beliefs. Positive and negative introspection describe a property in which the agent knows both what it does know and what it does know. And finally, fact consideration describes that if a fact is true in the world, the agent knows that it considers it possible. This kind of encompasses the idea of the dual of K. So if an agent does not know not a fact, that's another way of describing that it considers that fact possible. We bring these up because they impose important restrictions on the way we represent our logic and the way we reason. And 2 subclasses that we're going to be focusing on in our planning approaches are KD45 and S5, and different axioms hold in these subclasses. So in KD45, we're talking about logic for belief. So the truth axiom does not hold. If an agent knows something, that's not necessarily true. So we represent this with the belief operator, and then generally we represent our agent as rational, so it holds only consistent beliefs and it's able to perform positive and negative introspection. The other type of subclass that we're going to be talking about in our second approach is S5, and this is logic for knowledge. In this subclass, the truth axiom does hold. So we're using the knowledge operator because if an agent knows something, then that thing is automatically true. Again, if we remember the difference between knowledge and beliefs, an agent can't know an untrue thing. So we're logic for knowledge, we're using the knowledge operator, and again, we're generally modeling a rational agent where either positive introspection and fact consideration hold or negative introspection holds. So this is a kind of quick recap of multi-agent epistemic logic, and now we're going to get into our first approach in integrating epistemic logic into planning called RPMEP. I'm going to do a quick overview of RPMEP before we kind of get into the weeds of this encoding. So this is a consolidated depiction of what our epistemic planning problem looks like. We have our set of propositions, our agents, our start state, our goal state, and a finite set of actions. And these actions affect not only the world state, but also our epistemic state. So it updates our beliefs. And the idea behind this approach is that we're going to kind of try and cram our epistemic planning problem into a classical planning problem. So we're taking this planning problem, we're encoding it as a classical planning problem with now our belief formula is going to be our fluence. So in our classical planning problem, we're typically used to representing, we have our set of fluent atoms, our goal, our initial state, and our set of operators. And we're typically used to having our atoms describe states of the world and properties of the world, and our actions affecting physical updates and physical change to the world. And now we're going to try and encode our belief formula as these fluent actions and have our operators in our classical planning problem update our beliefs. So if we're looking at this coin in the box scenario, examples of what our fluence might look like is all these combinations of our possible beliefs. So that our robot believes tails, our robot believes heads, and then nested beliefs. So a robot believes green believes tails, our robot believes green, believes the robot believes heads, and we use this as our set of fluents. And in our classical planning problem, where now our operators are going to affect change on our belief state. So we're not only acting and affecting the physical state of the world, we're now acting and affecting the belief state of our agents. Can anyone think, so what might be one major advantage to this approach? What can we do with a problem that's encoded as a classical planning problem? Yeah. Exactly. So we can use any state-of-the-art, off-the-shelf classical planner to solve our problem. That's like a major, major advantage to this approach. Can you think of what some challenges or limitations might be to trying to shove this into a classical planning encoding? Yeah.
Logics have logical consequence for your first axiom and
Exactly. So we need to ensure logical closure now of all of our actions. So the typical add and delete effects might not be so intuitive now. So we need to be really careful about how we're encoding our actions and their updates to our belief state. So generally, this encoding, we can only solve a syntactically restricted class of epistemic planning problems. So we have some challenges, and we can think about, we can only plan to a bounded depth of nested beliefs. So like we saw in the last slide, we have to define a finite set of fluents. We can only define, and we have to define all of these fluents down here. So we can't have an infinite depth of nested beliefs that we can reason in. And we typically bound these to a depth of 3 because we've seen that humans typically don't reason beyond a nested depth of 3. And also just the number of fluents grows exponentially with each level of nesting. We also define that the properties of KD45 must hold. This is generally a decision about how we model our agents. We model our agents as rational, and we're also planning in the belief space. So this type of problem allows us to represent problems where our agents have false beliefs because we're planning in the belief space. And also we're not allowed to model disjunctive beliefs. So if we tried to model disjunctive beliefs as something like a fluent, our planning space would explode. Otherwise, classical planners cannot represent a disjunction between two fluents. So we're not able to represent disjunctive beliefs. As you can see, the general trend is that we're reducing computational complexity by sacrificing some level of expressivity of this type of planning problem, but we're still able to generally model an interesting set of problems. So let's revisit some of the goals that we talked about we might have and think about if we're able to model these types of goals. So we said one goal we might have would be this deception goal, that our robot believes heads, our robot believes green believes tails, and our robot believes blue believes tails. So our robot takes a look in the box, has a belief, but maybe makes a dishonest announcement. Do we think that this is a type of goal that we would be able to represent with this approach? So this is because we are able to represent nested beliefs, we are able to represent false beliefs, and we are able to represent a robot having, or an agent having a belief that is different from what it believes others believe. Let's talk about the second goal that we thought about. So the second goal, this is a little bit more simplified. We want the robot to believe heads, and we want our green agent to see the robot look in the box and believe that the robot believes heads or tails. Do you think that we can model this in this approach? I say head shake, why not? Yeah, exactly. So we can't model disjunctive beliefs. So this kind of exposes one of the limitations to these kind of problems is we can't say that our agent has a belief that our other, we can't model an agent having a belief in some space unless we explicitly know what they believe. So we can't say it believes this or this. It has some general knowledge about the value of the coin without knowing exactly what it believes. So that's a really general overview to RPMEP, and now we're going to get into more of the specifics about how we ensure logical enclosure when we're encoding our actions. And to do this, we're going to have to draw on this idea of conditional effects in classical planning. This is just a facet of classical planning that we haven't covered yet in class, so I'm going to give a really quick overview of what conditional effects look like before we dive into the specifics. So classical planning, this is our typical setup like we've covered, and we have so our fluence, our goal, our initial state, and then our set of operators that have preconditions and add and delete effects. We can model the add and delete effects of our classical planner as conditional effects. So what this means is that they have additional conditions that must hold or not hold in order to fire, and these additional conditions don't affect the actual action. So they're not in the preconditions of the action. If they're not present, that doesn't prevent the action from occurring. It just prevents these conditional effects from occurring. So the conditional effect occurs only if additional conditions hold, but it doesn't overall prevent the action itself from being applied if these conditions don't hold. This might become a little bit more clear in an example. We also go further to just divide up the conditions of our conditional effects into positive and negative conditions. So for example, if L is some conditional effect, it fires only when our positive conditions hold and when our negative conditions don't hold. This is just like a definition that we use because it's helpful later on when we're talking about our encoding for RPMEP. But if we're just looking at a typical classical planning example in blocks world, for example, we might have an action pick up block, and we might want to be able to represent that if the agent is strong and the block is not slippery, the agent holds the block. So in this case, holding the block would be our positive effect that we add in the case that strong holds and slippery does not hold. So strong would be our positive effect or positive condition, slippery would be our negative condition. So if strong holds and slippery does not hold, then holding block is going to be an add effect. It's a conditional effect. Again, whether strong and slippery hold or do not hold will not affect our actual ability to execute the pickup block action. It's just affecting this, whether this conditional effect will fire or not. Another example is if the block is big, then the agent's hand will no longer be free. So in this case, our positive condition is big block. If this holds, then we remove hand free from our current state of the world, so it's a negative effect. Are there any general conditions about about conditional effects? Okay. So one, looking at this applied kind of high-level example of how this could be applied in our belief space approach, if we have an action honest announce, and we want our robot to honestly announce heads to room 1, a precondition for this action might be that robot believes heads, if we want it to be an honest announcement. And this is going to affect who perceives the announcement and who perceives others perceiving the announcement. So if our green agent is in the room, in this instance they're all in the room, then our green agent is going to believe heads. If our blue agent believes that green is in the room and is also in the room, then our blue agent is going to believe that our green agent believes heads because, yeah.
In this scenario,
Yeah.
is there a who believes is there always who knows who's in the room?
So if you remember in this, when we're talking about this approach, we're always going to be using the belief operator because we're operating in KD 45. So we're something that the agent knows is not necessarily true. So therefore we use belief and not know. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions about this? So we're going to get in now to the specifics about how we ensure that you can imagine that there are many effects that we might need to include, many conditional effects we might need to include for one action. And Lucian's going to get in the specifics about how we ensure we include all this. Yeah.
All right.
So we talked about how conditional effects are really useful for modeling our problem, and now we're going to get into our proper doxastic knowledge bases, which is what we're going to use as our actual representation in order to have consistent modeling of our beliefs in this RPMEP overall syntactic system. So we need to have some useful representation, we need to have consistent terms and a consistent method of expressing epistemic logic as we move through these problems. So a PDKB, which is a proper doxastic knowledge base, is some set or conjunction of these things called restricted modal literals. Now, keep in mind that we can't have disjunctions here, so there's never going to be a disjunction in these sets either. So what is a restricted modal literal? These are a statement, which you can see the following form. This is similar to the forms that we saw earlier on how you can represent some kind of like knowledge statement, except this is a reduced form. So you can have a proposition, you can have the negation of some literal, or you can also have the belief statement for some literal. So we can build up statements involving belief and the negation of belief, but you can see that there's no disjunctions here, and there's also no knowledge because we're working in KD45, we only can use belief. So again, no knowledge. Now you can see that any of these agents can have beliefs, and any of those p-values are just original fluents. So things normal to the world can still hold, like just facts about the world, such as like the coin being heads in the coin example. That can still be expressed in our representation. So can anyone think of a reason why we might be restricting our expressivity here? Yeah, so the reason we restrict it is because we still don't want disjunctions to hold. So if we allowed our restricted modal literals to have disjunctions, then suddenly we'd be able to express things that aren't actually modelable in our problem. And additionally, if we added knowledge, then we would be messing up our whole knowledge base. So we need to make sure that we restrict our literals to only express the things that we want to express. So using our knowledge bases, we can create fluents out of our RMLs. We can just use these traditionally as fluents, just plug them straight into our classical planners. We must use our bounded depth and a bounded number of agents because we need to be able to reason about these knowledge bases, but if we have unbounded numbers of agents and depth, it just goes infinitely. And we can express any of our states, preconditions, and goals as sets of these RMLs, which we, again, call PDKBs. Now, again, this is very important. We can only use this to model problems that don't rely on disjunctions. So that's a major limitation of this approach, and that's something that you always have to keep in mind. So with that out of the way, we can move on to how KD45 and belief revision works in this system. So here we can see we need to have some method to actually express how logic works in our system. So in normal classical planning, you just have effects that add or remove fluents from your system, but here things get a little bit more complicated. Whenever you're adding knowledge, you have to maintain the properties of KD45, which actually means that you need to do a little bit more when it comes to adding and removing effects. So, for example, if blue is looking in the box, then both green and the robot are going to believe that blue knows what's in the box. And also, they're going to have to update their belief spaces even more. And blue will also have to update its belief space to make sure that it's only holding consistent beliefs, right? Like blue couldn't look in the box, see that the coin is heads, and still believe that the coin is tails. And so that's something that we have to actually keep in mind and explicitly state when we're modeling these problems. So there's three main methods that people have used to kind of express these cascading effects when you're updating your belief space. The first one is these things called ancillary conditional effects, which are really useful because they're kind of a standard epistemic approach, and a lot of people and a lot of papers have been written about how people use these to update conditions in their traditional conditional planning. And the only problem with these is that if we're using non-binary effects, so something that's not just true or false or just on and off, then our search space can actually explode to really, really large values. So it's useful only really if we're using binary effects. If we're using things that can be a whole set of values, then things can get a little bit crazy. The second are these objects called derived predicates. This is really when you have some kind of predicate, right? This is a effect of an action, or this is a precondition to an action that is built upon smaller predicates. So a dummy example would be if we wanted to express that a block A is above a block B, and all we know is that maybe block Z is on block B and block A is on block Z, then we could use these derived predicates to basically reason about the fact that block A is still above block B, even though it's not explicitly stated, and we can kind of generate these on the fly. So these are actually pretty useful because they have some planner support. In the optic planner that we were using, it actually did not have support for this, but there are planners that do support derived predicates, and so they are useful in some cases. The only thing is they're not really generalizable because you can't apply them to any planner, and they have some limitations as far as what you can derive because knowledge bases can become a little bit convoluted. So the third are these things called ramification actions, and that's really just embodying the cascading effect of making any decision. It's very intuitive. It's really just what happens when you do anything, right? Like if I knock over my water bottle, I know that the table's going to be wet. I know that some electronics might get destroyed. That's a really intuitive way of kind of thinking about how the world and our belief state changes when we perform an action. But the only thing is, it's not really supported by any planners. So it's really useful for reasoning about these problems. You can add in heuristics really easily, but it's not very useful for planning. So the thing that we're going to be focusing on primarily are these ancillary conditional effects because they are so widely used already, and there's a lot to be talked about when using these. So a quick preview on what an ancillary effect is. They're really necessary for expressing the logical conditions of KD45 and making sure that our KD45 axioms are always holding in our PDDL environment. And it also creates a framework for updating our beliefs in a really consistent and concrete manner. So there's, as we're going to see later on, there's only a set amount of additions that we need to add for every conditional effect in order to ensure that KD45 is always holding. And that's actually really valuable because with these set amount of additions that we need to have, we can express everything that we want to be able to express. So what's the structure of an ancillary effect? Right? We have some kind of conditional effect that might be in the either addition or negation like effect set. And for any of these, we have to add a couple more conditional effects to either the positive or negative effect set, which accomplish some kind of logical purpose. So there's a couple logical purposes that we're going to get into, and basically you'll see that this general structure of adding more conditional effects whenever we have some kind of set conditional effect is going to vary and change depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So the four types that we're going to be looking at are negation removal, logical closure, logical unclosure, which is really just the negation equivalent of closure, and uncertain firing. So these are, with only these four conditions, we're actually able to model our entire KD45 space, which is really nice because for every conditional effect, we only need four others to be able to fully express our space, which is very, very useful. So the first one, negation removal, it's really just the idea that anytime we're adding a belief, we have to remove the negation of that belief. And this is important because in KD45, we're not able to hold contradictory beliefs, right? You can't believe that the coin is heads and believe that the coin is not heads. So anytime we're adding an effect, if those same conditions are holding, then we also need to remove the negation of that effect. So one example here is if B is peeking in the box, if that leads B to believe that the coin is heads, then B looking into the box also would imply that it's removing its belief that the coin was not heads. So you can see that at first it's adding the effect that B believes it's heads, and then it is removing the effect that B does not believe it is heads. So this ensures that we're actually staying within the realms of KD45 and we're not doing anything crazy with our belief states. So the second is KD45 closure. This really means that any consequences of our actions are going to be propagated properly as per the closure requirements of KD45. So anytime something is added as per some conditional effect, we also need to add all of the things that would be necessary in order for closure to continue holding. And I think that's going to become a little bit more grounded with an example. So if, for example, B looking into the box means that B is not going to believe that the coin is tails, then we also need to add the effect that B looking into the box means that it believes that the coin is not tails. But you can see that the not operator is moving, because in order for closure to hold, things that B believes, it needs to believe the inner elements as well. So it can't just believe something without believing what's inside. And this is really important when we have further nested beliefs. So when we're going to like belief depth of 3, if the green agent is believing something about the blue agent, it needs to actually believe the things that the blue agent is believing as well. So, or it doesn't need to believe those, but it needs to actually believe that the blue agent is believing those. So this makes sure that those are actually held, and it's really important because we need to make sure that anything that gets expressed needs to be enclosed within KD45. So this is still just the process of making sure that KD45 holds at all times. So the opposite version of this would be unclosure. Anytime we're removing some kind of effect, we need to make sure that we're removing all the things that would be true due to closure. So this is really just like, this is the exact opposite of what closure was, where we were adding anything that would have to be true for closure to be true. If we're removing some effect, we remove all of those elements as well. So as an example, if B looking into the box would mean that the robot does not know that, or if B looking into the box means that the robot no longer is unsure about whether B knows heads, right? Because the robot's looking, the robot sees blue look into the box, and now it cannot hold the belief that it doesn't know, or it doesn't believe that B knows its heads. Then we also need to add the effect that that we're removing the belief that the robot does not, that the robot believes that blue does not believe that the coin is heads. So you can see it's really just the exact opposite of closure. This is removing anything that might be added by closure requirements. Now the third and potentially the most complicated version of this is uncertain firing. This is the idea that you can become uncertain about things if the conditions that you might have to hold for you to know something are not true. So this is really important because when we're working in epistemic spaces, you can kind of reach points where you're not entirely sure about what the space is. So this is something that might be a little bit different from classical planning problems because typically things are more deterministic there. Here, there are points where you just don't know, and we need to have some way of modeling that. And this is where uncertain firing comes in. So anytime there's some condition that allows an effect to be added, we also need to basically reason about what might happen if we're now unsure about those conditions holding. So you can see this is kind of a complicated syntax, but anytime some condition gets added, we now have to look through. You can see the conditions are shifted around a little. So now we look at the negation of everything in the positive conditions along with all of the negative conditions, and they're all centered in the negative condition box. So basically, if the negation of all of the positive ones is not holding, so basically if we're unsure about whether or not the positive conditions are holding, but the negative conditions are still not holding, then suddenly we're unsure about whether or not the condition is holding. So this will be, again, grounded in an example. So if R, the robot watching the box, and B looking into the box means that the robot is going to believe that blue believes heads, then if the robot is unsure about whether or not it was watching the box and also unsure about whether or not B peeked into the box, we have to remove the fact that the robot does not believe that blue believes heads. So this is a little bit, it might take some time to become comfortable with this idea of removing the negation of a belief and that leading to uncertainty. But this is something that's very important in epistemic planning, because if we remove the negation of some kind of knowledge, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're adding the negation of that. So if we're just removing some kind of knowledge from our space, it's not like we're adding the opposite. We are just becoming unsure about it. So this is really important, because there are times when we can become unsure about things in our space. And does anyone have any questions about how this or any previous ones work? All right, sweet. So we can move on to how we actually revise our belief, so we talked about how we revise our beliefs and keep holding KD45 in our space, and now we're going to be talking about mutual awareness, which is the idea that if an agent is watching something, they're going to be aware that other agents might be watching something as well. So mutual awareness is the idea that if an agent has some ability U to witness some action, we're going to need to model the idea that it is going to update its belief state based on other agents being present and other agents being able to observe that effect as well. So this is some really complicated syntax, and you can take the time to really look through it and try to understand exactly what's going on. But the main idea is that if an agent is aware of their surroundings, they're going to update their beliefs to match the truth, and they kind of expect other agents to do so as well. So first we have to look at the binary term, which is U. This is something that you may have not seen before. This is really just whether an agent can observe the effect or not observe the effect. So it's a binary term. It can hold true or false. And if it's holding true, an agent is always going to be observing the effects of actions. If it's false, the agent is never going to be. So some simple examples of mutual awareness are simple things like if rain being somewhere and snow not being somewhere leads the ground to be wet, then if an agent believes that it's raining and also doesn't believe that it's snowing, it's going to believe that it's wet outside. Similarly, if it's raining and it's not snowing leads you to remove the effect that it's snowy out, then if an agent believes that it's raining and doesn't believe that it's snowy, it's not going to believe that it's snowy out. Something that's more applicable to our actual case with the coin in the box is if blue peeking into the box means that, or if green peeking into the box, sorry for the typo, means that green believes that it's heads, then if the robot believes that green peeked into the box, then the robot is going to believe that green believes it's heads. So it's really a kind of a simple idea, but the syntax of it gets a little bit more convoluted as we get into nested beliefs. But it's really just this simple idea of you observing something and expecting others to be able to observe that as well. So a quick recap of how RPMap kind of functions is we have some kind of epistemic planning problem that we want to model, and a good way to do that, or a kind of a simple way to do that, is by modeling it as a classical planning problem. So we find a way to encapsulate our epistemic state and kind of cram it into a classical planning problem that can then be solved really efficiently with kind of state-of-the-art solvers. So the obvious benefits of this are being able to use classical solvers, which are highly optimized, and it's going to lead to very fast solutions to our problems. And once we kind of understand the syntax that's required for adding conditional effects with those ancillary effects, the formulation of these problems can actually become very quick. So that's two huge benefits to using this, but it also has some limitations. The first of which is obviously we can't have disjunctive beliefs. This, while maybe seeming small, is actually a pretty big limitation, because there's a lot of times where you want to be able to just know that someone knows something without knowing specifically what they know. So in the coin in the box example, if you see someone peek into the box, and this is the way that maybe we logically reason through it ourselves, if you see someone peek into a box and you don't know the value of the coin, you just know that they know the coin's value. And in our representation with RPMF, there's no way of modeling that. You actually would need to know whether the coin is heads or tails in order to have knowledge about that. And the other thing is that we really can't model our entire epistemic space. So we looked back at cryptKey models earlier. RPMap is unable to encapsulate the entire functionality of cryptKey models, and we can't really reason about our possible worlds in the way that we do when we're using cryptKey models. And this is something that's maybe a little bit more minor, is that we can only work in the belief space when we're doing RPMap. So using KD45 is only belief-oriented, and that means that we now have lost a lot of the knowledge aspect of it. And this is maybe less important because it's still useful in a lot of ways to reason about beliefs, because beliefs can be false and we can model deception and things like that. But that's something to just keep in consideration when you're trying to think about what might be the most useful for our problems. So we covered the classical planning approach through our belief revision, our knowledge bases, and how to encapsulate mutual awareness. And now I'm going to hand it off to Robert to cover our dynamic epistemic logic and how we can extend our models to capture more than just what RPMap can.
There we go. All right. Hello. So we've just gone over RPMap, and now we're going to be talking about a slightly different approach to this work, using dynamic epistemic logic. So if we remember back to the beginning of this presentation, we saw a lot of stuff about cryptKey models, and they're a really great way to talk about epistemic logic, but now we want to actually operate on them. We want to be able to search through different cryptKey models. We want to be able to affect changes on those cryptKey models via actions, and then search through those. And that's what we're going to get to do using dynamic epistemic logic. We don't have to convert back into propositions. We're just using the models. We're going to be continuing to use the example of the coin in the box, where we have the robot, the green agent, the blue agent, and a box with heads. And we're also going to define some initial conditions, some actions and states that the box could be tails, it could be heads. Any of our agents could be looking, or they could be not be looking, and the same actions hold as before. We need to build a set of initial conditions for our model, and to do that, we also need to know, Here we go. We're going to be building a set of initial conditions for our model, but to do that, we need to be able to turn our propositional logic into a set of cryptKey models. And to do that, we're going to put a couple limitations on our propositional logic, such that they conform to finitary S5 theories. We've already seen S5 theories earlier in the lecture, and we've said that they're really useful for talking about knowledge. Compared to KD45, which talk all about belief, S5, if you know something is true, then it must be true, provably so, about the world. Finitary S5 theories give us a couple extra limitations on that. They say that the set of propositions that we have can only be of these types. So we can have propositions about the world, we can have common knowledge, which is to say that everyone knows that this is true, every single agent in the world. So we can have common knowledge that says everyone knows that some agent knows that this fact is true. We could also have common knowledge that says everyone knows that some agent either knows this fact is true or knows the inverse of that fact is true. So some agent must know what the true value of that fact is. Or we could have common knowledge to say that everyone knows that this agent has no idea what the true fact of the world is. So let's talk about an example using our coin in the box example. So a simple proposition might be that the coin is facing heads. That's just fact, true about the world, no questions. An example of common knowledge in the second row is that everyone must know that the robot knows that the coin is head. And that also implies that everyone also knows that the coin is actually heads, because you cannot know something about someone else's knowledge without knowing that fact yourself. The next one is that everyone knows that the robot knows the coin's value, in which case we don't necessarily, an agent, might not necessarily know what the robot, I might not necessarily know what the coin's value is, but I know at the very least that the robot is aware of what that value is. The final one is that the robot has no idea what the coin's value is, and I'm aware of that fact. The nice thing about these finitary S5 theories is that we can use them to build initial conditions for our problem in crypty model space. So let's talk about what are the initial conditions of our example. Well, we know that the coin is heads, so we can say that not tails is true. That is one proposition. We know that everyone should be aware of whether or not everyone else is looking. So we can say that it's common knowledge that for every agent, they know whether every other agent is looking at the box. We're using this notation L_J to define whether or not an agent is actually looking at the box. And the final set of propositions here says that every agent knows for a fact that no other agent knows what's in the box as our initial conditions. Now we want to turn those into a crypty model, and here we have the result. When we say that, when we take the proposition that there's no that tail is false, we can also say that none of the agents know that the tail is false. So we must include both worlds, that the tail is true and that the tail is false, in our initial crypty model. We also denote which one is the actual real world by having that the double circle. You can see that's one where tail is false, aka the actual coin is facing heads. The second set of propositions says that everyone is aware that everyone else is looking. So we only have two worlds, and we have no worlds in which any agent is not looking at the box. We don't need them. They might exist in theory, but there's no way for any agent to go from the real world into those worlds, so we can exclude them from our model. The final proposition says that everyone is aware that no one knows where the real coin's value is. So we need to include the edge between the two worlds, and every single agent that we have can transition from one world to the other freely because they cannot distinguish between the two. We also add self-edges to all of the worlds. These are generally implied, but they're here for the sake of clarity. Oh, yes? So there is a construction process for this. There's a you do not have to build a crypty model. You can give a set of conjunctions of the form of finitary S5 theories, and you can build a crypty model from that programmatically. The reason why we can do that is because using only finitary S5 theories, we get the guarantee that there's going to be a finite set of worlds. That's where the finitary comes from. That's not necessarily a given. It's possible that you could have infinite sets of worlds without, if you give just a set of propositions. That's why these are so helpful, right? And you can sort of start to intuit the logic behind what that construction process is by what we've gone through in this slide, which is that you can see that propositions that no one knows anything about each need to create their own world. And if no one knows anything about those worlds, then you're going to have to create all of the different combinations of that. We only have one unknown, so we only have two possible combinations. And we have information about what connections there are and and what everyone does know. Now that we have an initial condition, which is that Kripke model we just had, we need some way to actually change that Kripke model over time through actions. And that's what we're going to be using different action updates for. So an example goal for this problem is that the robot should know that the coin is heads. It should know the contents of the box. The green agent should know that the robot knows. They saw the robot look. But the blue agent shouldn't know. Maybe you're friends with the green agent. You're not great friends with the blue agent. You don't want them to know. Okay? And as a person, we can fairly obviously think of a plan, which is that, well, I want to make sure that the blue agent doesn't know, so I should distract them at some point. I'm going to want to make sure the green agent does know, so maybe I'll signal them to look at the box to make sure that they are definitely looking. And then the robot can finally look in the box, see heads, and at that point, we should have reached our goal. So let's go through the plan, starting from our initial Kripke model, and see what does it look like for actions to change a Kripke model. First step is going to be distract the blue agent. So we say we want to distract the blue agent. In every single world where the blue agent is currently looking at the box, they're now not looking at the box. This one's a fairly simple action. It changes all the worlds. We get negations everywhere for L_B. Everyone's happy. Everyone knows that this happened. Everyone can see everyone else looking or not looking. Awesome. The second action, which we don't actually necessarily need because of our initial conditions, that everyone was already looking, would be to signal the green agent. They're already looking, so this action doesn't actually do anything. What about the final action? Maybe the robot can finally peek in the box and succeed. Plan done. So what happens when the robot peeks? Well, all of a sudden, the robot can no longer transition from the true ground state of the world to this other world that it could believe. Does that mean we're done? Maybe? Yes? Not really? Not quite. Because while we've successfully said that the robot knows that the coin is heads, therefore not tails, we've sort of left something out. We did all this work to make sure that the green was looking and the blue was not working. The blue is not looking. And in this model right now, there's no difference between green and blue. So when we take the action that the robot peeks, we also need to make a couple other changes to our Kripke model so that it looks a bit more like this. Now, there's a bit of an error in this page. That should not be in a double circle in the bottom right. Sorry about that. But when the robot peeks, in addition to the robot knowing that it is in the top right world and that the coin is tails, we also need to take into account that the blue agent did not see the robot peek. So it equivalently must believe that it is either in a world where that action did not occur or a world where that action did occur. So when the robot peeks, we need to additionally create two new worlds that are essentially copies of the current worlds, but the action that just occurred did not occur, and the only agent that can transition from the true worlds to these worlds is the blue agent, who did not see the action occur. Does that make sense for why we just added extra worlds into the Kripke model? Yeah? Awesome. So we've now seen that actions can increase the number of worlds, and they could also decrease the number of worlds. As you can see, like the robot is only believes one world is possible. Now we just want to double check that does this world, following the plan that we proposed, successfully meet our end goals, right? So the end goals were what? They were that the robot knows that it's not tails, so the coin is heads. We want the green agent to know that either the robot knows tails or the robot knows not tails. So we just want to know green agent knows that the robot knows something. And finally, we want to know that the blue agent does not know anything about what the robot knows. So how do we actually evaluate a Kripke model to figure out the truth value? Let's take a look at the first proposition. We're asking a question about what the robot knows. So we start from the true world, which is up in the top right. And we say, okay, starting here, what are all the possible worlds that the robot can reach? There's no outgoing edges from that world to another world, so that is the only world that the robot believes is possible. So the robot believes only that world, and in that world, not tails is true, so the robot must believe not tails. So the robot knows that we're in heads. The next one is asking a question about what does the green agent know? So we start again at the true world up in the top right. We say, okay, what are all the possible worlds the green agent believes in, which are the top right and the top left worlds, because there's an edge between those two and no edges anywhere else that green can take. So in those two worlds, is it true that the red agent either knows tails or knows not tails? Well, in the top right world, we've already said that the robot does not know tails. In the top left world, we can sort of see that by similar logic, there's no outgoing edges for the robot, and tails is true in that world only, so that must be true for that world. The final question is, does blue not know what, or if the robot knows? So we say, again, we're asking a question about the blue agent, so we say, what are the possible worlds that the blue agent can reach? We start from the true world, we find that it can reach all of these possible worlds, and then we say, is it true that in all of these possible worlds, either the robot knows tails or knows not tails? It's true for the top right, it's true for the top left, but it's not necessarily true for these bottom two. Because in these bottom two worlds, the robot can still transition easily between these two worlds. So it cannot tell if it knows tails or if it knows not tails. So we've now realized that the blue agent does not know this fact, and so this entire proposition is true. We've succeeded in our goal by making changes to the Kripke model. Now that we can make changes to the Kripke model, now that we've gone through a single plan, let's talk about how we can start to create these plans using search, everyone's favorite. For an example, we're looking at our initial state again, where Kripke model is connecting two possible worlds. There's tails and there's not tails, everything else is the same. And we might say, okay, first we're going to check that robot peaks. And it makes a change over there. Everyone's looking, so we don't need to do any extra updates to the possible worlds. Okay, well that's one possible action we can make. Another one might be that instead we signal the robot, in which case the robot was already looking, no changes to the worlds occur. Another possible action is that we could distract the robot, in which case L_R becomes false in all of the worlds. You can sort of see where we're going with this. We're trying every single action that we can take from our initial state. So again, maybe blue should peak first for some reason, in which case their edge disappears, connecting the two worlds. Next, we're going to go back to the first action we took, and look at the Kripke model there, after exhaustively searching all of the actions, and say, okay, what are all of the actions that we can take from this Kripke model? We try those out, we build all of the different Kripke models that can create, and we say, okay, we now have a lot of different Kripke models that are possibilities. So next we're going to look at all the Kripke models that we asked originally from, and then we can move on to the next layer. We've sort of just described BFS, or breadth first search. And that is essentially what the epistemic forward plan, epistemic, there we go. You say it enough times and it just goes away. Sorry, the epistemic forwards planner does. It's doing an exhaustive search over all the possible crypto models that it can reach, starting at an original crypto model, searching out, going one layer at a time, moving on, adding things to a queue, until it finds some crypto model similar to the one we described, where all of our goal propositions are finally satisfied. This is the pseudocode. We don't need to look too closely at that. The important points I want to point out are that at every possible pointed crypto model, we're testing it for completion. We're saying, does this crypto model successfully satisfy the propositions in the same way that we went through originally in our example? We also want to know that it's applying every action that's possible to the crypto model in the same way that we were applying actions one by one when we're going through the plan. So it's taking a crypto model, making changes to possibly the propositions, possibly the edges, possibly adding extra roles in and connecting those to the original crypto model to update the actions. And then it's adding those back into a queue to continue the search. One thing to note, though, is that we mentioned a heuristic. Because right now, all I've described is BFS, but on epistemic states. We can do better with that heuristic, which we're going to be talking about right now, with the epistemic planning graph. The epistemic planning graph is a way to build our heuristic. So let's run through a quick example from some arbitrary state, such as our initial state, as an example. We can do this from any possible state. When we're building the epistemic planning graph, similar to before, we're going to be going through and trying all the possible actions that we can get to, and building all the possible crypto models that we can build from that epistemic state. After that, we're going to, once again, go to the first state, the first one that we found, build all of the crypto models for that epistemic state. But, unlike before, we're not doing an exhaustive search. We're actually doing a relaxed planning graph. So, for example, we can see that by taking the action B peaks and then R peaks, we get to the exact same point as we would have if we took the actions R peaks and then B peaks. Those are, obviously, there's no difference in the initial states. We're just taking the actions in different orders. There's no difference to the crypto model in that case. So, for the epistemic planning graph, we don't consider them to be different in any case. What we're essentially doing is starting from an initial state and building outwards, one layer at a time, and getting every set of possible epistemic states that we can reach in that number of actions. So in K1, that takes at least one action to reach. In K2, it takes at least 2 actions to reach. K3 takes at least 3 actions to reach that epistemic state. And we don't care exactly what those actions were. We're not keeping track of that to any degree. This relaxed planning graph, though, lets us build the heuristic that we're going to be using to upgrade the epistemic forwards planner. And this is the pseudocode for the epistemic planning graph. There's nothing too exciting other than we should mention that we are always going to stop if we reach a set of states from which any action results in more epistemic states that are in that set of states. So once we can't actually grow anymore, we can stop. That's our termination case in this algorithm. So what does the epistemic planning graph allow us to do in terms of heuristics is that we can use, as an example, this sum heuristic. What we can do is take from the epistemic planning graph and say, okay, our goal is some set of propositions. For example, we wanted to know that the robot knows the coin is heads, the blue agent knows that the coin is, the blue agent knows that the robot knows, and the green agent doesn't know. A set of propositions combined in an AND operator, right? What we can do is we can say, okay, when is the first time we see the first proposition? What is the first state that satisfies that proposition? And we can count what level each proposition occurs on. So in this example, two propositions occur after one action, and a third proposition takes at least two actions. We're not looking for a state that succeeds at finding. We're not looking for one state that has all of the propositions. We're just looking for when is the first time we see this proposition, and we're using that for our heuristic. So this is an example of what that might look like for our goal. For example, in this current state right here, which is the same as our starting state, we know that blue knows that blue knows that the robot does not know what the coin is, because the robot just doesn't know what the coin is. We've succeeded on this proposition. This is definitely not our goal, it's our starting state, but we found a proposition. We can see that by the robot peeking, we succeed in the robot knowing what the goal is, and we succeed in green knowing that the robot knows what the coin's value is, but it doesn't have this, so it's obviously not our goal state either. What that gives us is a way of thinking, well, the robot peeking is probably going to be a good action, so we should explore that in general before maybe the blue agent peeking, which is not part of our goal at all. In fact, it's almost antithetical to our goal. And we can see that for this state, there it is. We can see that the total sum here is going to be 2. We have 2 propositions on level 1. We have a proposition over here on level 0. We can calculate the sum here. We can also be certain that the heuristic is going to be admissible, because in our final plan, we're going to reach some sort of state that has all of the possible propositions in that one state. And that's going to take some number of actions to get there. And so we can say that, well, in that case, the heuristic from that state would be the sum of that number of actions, the level. We're looking at where the actions first occur, so though in our final plan, those cannot occur before the first time those actions occur from a state, so we can say that the heuristic is admissible. Does that make sense? Cool. The heuristic, unsurprisingly, makes our performance a lot better. In particular, it's very helpful for larger plan lengths. So the further you're going to have to explore and the more branching paths you have, the more the heuristic is helpful. And for very small plan lengths where you only have to go maybe 1 or 2 levels in, it might not be worth it to do all of the setup for all these actions to calculate the heuristic, in which case maybe you're best off just running the simple breadth first search. Yeah. The second and third? Sorry, yes. EFP stands for Epistemic Forward Planner. So that is the breadth first search version of this algorithm. PG plan graph, Epistemic Forward Planner. So that is with a heuristic. In this case, they specify that plan graph, Epistemic Forward Planner is using the sum heuristic for this case, and the researchers found that the sum heuristic generally did better than other heuristics that they tested, which is why we're talking about it right now.
So roughly what plan length are we?
So in this case, L is the shortest possible plan length, and because it's we're doing an exhaustive search, and so long as the heuristic is admissible, we know that we'll find the optimal plan length. So you can see here that that's like 5 levels that you're going to have to explore before you find the...
So
Mm-hmm.
in their runs, those are still pretty short plans.
Yes, they're fairly short plans.
But did you get a sense from the literature what are the maximum length they spend a diode on?
Well, this is just an issue with the Epistemic Forward Planner that I'll probably touch on in a couple slides, but is that it's not particularly fast. That's just, it is fast. It's planning graph The heuristic makes it faster, but compared to other methods, specifically the method that we talked about earlier, it is slower. And that's the price that you pay to use this sort of semantic approach where you're talking about the entire Kripke model and you can model everything in the system. As an example, we can talk about nested statements of this Kripke model. We can say, start from one world, say, this is what this person believes the world is. We sort of recursively go down, say, okay, from here, what does this next person believe? Recursive again, go down, what does this next person believe? And you can just keep doing that. The Kripke model is able to contain all of that information. The same way, we can include logical distinctions, which our previous approach could not. But it is slow compared to the syntactic approach. That's just the price that you pay to use a more semantic model in your search. So, syntactic approach, we're maintaining the knowledge as a set of formulas and updating them with belief updates and revision. With our semantic approach in Epistemic Word Planner, we're using Kripke models and updating those using dynamic epistemic logic. It's just going to be slower. Cool. Any questions? No? Do you want to talk really quickly about the P set?
1 minute.
Yeah.
Should I?
One of the additional things, how much it's slower, that specifies the
Yeah.
slower. Are we talking about orders of the
I don't remember off the top of my head what it was, but I'd have to double check. They have comparison of some test cases between the two. So, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I have to go double check.
Yeah, I'll just go real quick. I don't really have a slide for this, but for the P set, so we're going to focus on the RP-map method. And what we'll have you do on that is you'll implement a subset of the functionality there for converting from the epistemic logic into the propositional logic, and for adding some of those ancillary effects that we saw are needed so that when you update your belief about something, any other beliefs that are related will be updated in the right way. You won't implement everything, but you'll do part of that, and then we'll showcase a couple domains, and the kind of files for this are very similar to the paddle files we had from problem set 3, so they should look pretty familiar, and it's not too hard to write up a file for a domain, and we'll have a couple that you can look at so you can see, okay, what's something I could model with this, and you can run the planner on it and play around with it a little bit. That's all.
Thank you very much. Another great week. So next week we have our last advanced lecture, right? But we're pivoting the theme from deciding how to act, right? To try to infer what other agents are doing, right? So next week, right? First will be the advanced lecture, right? The motivation perception, say, or estimation in conscious writing, and then the next lecture will continue that theme with estimation of hybrid systems and dynamical systems. Right, and then we'll go back to another activity recognition development. Okay, so see you then.